The President Reagan, Ronald Reagan.
Reagan, white President Reagan, President Reagan, White House, President Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, White House, President Reagan, the President, Nancy Reagan, the President Reagan, President Reagan, President Reagan, President Reagan, President Reagan, President Reagan, White House, the President Reagan,
The White House, Reagan, President Reagan, the President Ronald Reagan, Reagan, the President, the White House, the President Ronald Reagan, the President Reagan, the President Reagan, the President Reagan, the White House, the President Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, President Reagan, Nancy Reagan, President Reagan, Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, the President Reagan, Nancy Reagan, the House, Reagan, the President Reagan, Nancy Reagan, the President Reagan, the White House, Reagan, Nancy Reagan, the President Reagan, the President, the White House, the President Reagan, Nancy Reagan, Nancy's President, the President Reagan, the President, the White House, the President Ronald Reagan, the President Reagan, the President Reagan, President Reagan,
President
Reagan, the President Reagan,
Nancy Reagan,
Ronald Reagan, Nancy Reagan, the White House, Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan, Nancy Reagan.